What if your delay isn't resistance, but constant verification? Every time you look for evidence, you confess absence, and reality must agree. Most people believe results are the proof of progress, that movement in the outer world is the signal that something is finally working. From that assumption, a quiet tension is born. The eyes keep scanning reality. The mind keeps asking, is it here yet? Did it change? Is it closer? And without realizing it, attention is no longer resting in creation, but standing guard over absence. This is the modern trap, measuring progress by external results instead of inner position. The habit feels logical, even responsible, yet it is precisely this watching that slows everything down. The more you monitor reality for confirmation, the more you announce to consciousness that the desired state is still missing. This is why Neville Goddard issued such a subtle but severe warning. He explained that when you watch the effect, you suspend the cause. Consciousness in his teaching is not impressed by hope or effort, but by occupancy. To constantly look for evidence is to step out of the very state that would produce it. It is like planting a seed and then returning to the soil every morning to check whether it has grown. The digging is not neutral. Each time the earth is disturbed, the natural process is delayed. The seed was not failing, the interference was. In the same way, reality is not slow to respond. Attention is simply being withdrawn too soon. What most people call impatience is not emotional at all. It is positional. It is the inability to remain seated in a new assumption without standing up to verify whether the chair is still there. The inner shift may have occurred, but the position is not being held. Consciousness keeps oscillating between having and checking, between being and waiting, and in that oscillation nothing stabilizes long enough to harden into fact. The moment you watch for results, you subtly relocate yourself into the future, and whatever is placed in the future can never feel complete now. When this ancient idea is translated into modern language, the principle becomes even clearer. Joe Dispenza speaks of identity coherence, the alignment between who you believe you are and how you consistently think, feel, and perceive. From that perspective, change is not delayed because it is difficult, but because coherence must first stabilize. The nervous system, the subconscious, and perception itself reorganize quietly before any visible outcome appears. Once that inner coherence is sustained, the external world has no option but to reorganize in response. The delay is not resistance, it is gestation. This is why chasing results is such a costly mistake. It feels active, but it is actually a withdrawal of faith from the only place where creation happens. The deeper truth is simpler and far more demanding. Results arrive faster when you stop checking for them, not because you are ignoring reality, but because you are finally remaining in the cause instead of chasing the echo. There is one thing, and only one thing, that must be persisted in. Not effort, not repetition, not visualization marathons, and not emotional highs. As this unfolds, you will see that when the inner position is held steadily enough, reality does not negotiate, delay, or argue. It bends because it has no alternative. Looking for proof confirms absence. At first glance, searching for proof feels harmless, even intelligent. The mind tells itself that checking progress is how alignment is measured, how correction happens, how certainty is built. Yet beneath that logic lies a quieter signal being sent to consciousness. Every time attention turns outward to ask whether something has appeared, it confirms that the desired state is not being lived in now. This is the core distinction between effect watching and cause occupying. One stance waits for reality to speak first. The other speaks so consistently that reality must answer. Consciousness responds not to desire, but to residence. Where you stand inwardly is what determines what can appear outwardly. An ordinary analogy reveals this mechanism with surprising precision. Imagine an oven heating a meal. Each time the door is opened to check whether the food is ready, heat escapes and the temperature drops. Nothing is wrong with the oven, and nothing is wrong with the food. The interruption itself is the delay. In the same way, repeatedly checking the outer world for confirmation cools the inner assumption. Attention leaks away from the cause and returns to the effect, and the state that was forming loses its stability. The creation was underway, but it was never allowed to finish. Result chasing keeps consciousness permanently future-based. The inner dialogue subtly says, "Soon it will happen, any moment now, I'll feel settled once I see it." But the future is not a creative position, it is a holding pattern. What is placed in the future cannot feel complete, and what is not complete cannot objectify. This is why effort so often produces exhaustion without movement. The mind is working, visualizing, affirming, but the position of consciousness remains outside the fulfilled state, hovering just beyond it, waiting for permission from appearances. This is why Neville Goddard insisted that creation is finished inwardly first, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but literally. The moment the assumption is occupied without wavering, the act is complete. From that point on, the outer world is only catching up. To keep watching for results is to declare that the act is still unfinished. It is to reopen what was already sealed. Reality does not resist fulfillment. It simply mirrors the position being occupied. And when that position is one of waiting for proof, absence is the only honest reflection it can offer. There is a quiet relief hidden in this understanding. If results are not the lever, then effort can finally relax. Control can loosen its grip. The strain of constant monitoring dissolves, not because desire has been abandoned, but because it has been assumed. The question shifts naturally, almost effortlessly, away from "where is it?" and towards something far more consequential. If results are not what must be chased, then persistence must be aimed somewhere else entirely. It's not how long, it's where you live. Once the search for results loosens its grip, a deeper misunderstanding quietly surfaces. Many assume that persistence is a matter of endurance, that success belongs to whoever can hold on the longest, repeat the most, or wait with the greatest discipline. Time becomes the metric, and patience turns into a test of stamina. Yet this framing subtly misplaces the entire mechanism. Persistence, in its true sense, has nothing to do with how long something is practiced, and everything to do with where consciousness is resting. Duration without residence produces nothing stable. A simple image clarifies this distinction. Sitting in a chair does not require repeated effort. You do not need to keep reminding yourself to sit, nor do you tense your muscles to maintain the position. The moment you are seated, the act is complete, and remaining there requires no strain. Standing nearby and repeatedly touching the chair, however, does not accomplish the same thing. In the same way, briefly visiting a desired state and then stepping back out to observe it is not persistence. It is oscillation. Persistence begins only when the state is occupied as a place of residence rather than a destination. This is why time is such a misleading measurement. A person can affirm for years and never persist, while another can assume a state quietly and see movement unfold with surprising speed. What matters is not how often the idea is returned to, but how consistently identity remains aligned with it. Consistency of identity is not repetition of words or images. It is the settled sense of "this is where I am now." When that identity stabilizes, consciousness stops asking when, because the question no longer makes sense from that position. Persistence, then, is not an act of doing over and over. It is an act of remaining. It is the decision to stop stepping out of the state to evaluate it. The moment consciousness fully accepts a position, effort falls away. There is no longer anything to maintain, because maintenance implies threat of loss. Remaining feels natural precisely because it is no longer being monitored. The state holds itself, just as the chair supports the body without constant supervision. When this distinction is seen clearly, the pressure to force results dissolves even further. Persistence no longer feels like discipline or sacrifice, but like loyalty to an inner residence. The mind becomes quieter, not because desire has weakened, but because identity has settled. And from this settled position, a more precise question begins to form, not about time, not about repetition, but about the nature of the state itself. If persistence is about where consciousness lives, then the real inquiry becomes unavoidable. What exactly is the state that must be lived in? Naturalness is the signal reality obeys. When the question of persistence narrows to a single point, the answer often surprises the mind. It is not intensity, it is not excitement, it is not even unwavering belief in the way most people imagine belief. The state that reshapes reality is far quieter than that. It is the feeling of fulfillment experienced as normal, not celebrated, not dramatized, not defended, but lived in as an ordinary fact. Consciousness responds most powerfully to what feels natural, because what is natural is what is assumed to already be true. An image makes this distinction unmistakable. Wearing a brand new pair of shoes draws attention to itself. Every step is noticed. There is stiffness, awareness, and adjustment. Broken-in shoes, on the other hand, disappear from awareness entirely. They do not demand confirmation or correction. They simply function as part of the body's movement. In the same way, a fulfilled state that still feels new requires monitoring. A fulfilled state that feels normal no longer needs attention to sustain it. Reality responds to the latter, not the former. This is why fulfillment is calm rather than emotional. Excitement implies arrival is recent or uncertain. Calm implies that nothing has changed because nothing needed to change. The mind that is fulfilled is not scanning for validation because validation would be redundant. There is a quiet acceptance, a subtle sense of completion, as though the matter has already been settled. This is the internal signal that the subconscious recognizes as final. Neville Goddard identified this naturalness as the true marker of impression. When the desire no longer feels special, fragile, or conditional, it has been absorbed. At that point, repetition becomes unnecessary, and visualization fades on its own. The state has been impressed not through force, but through familiarity. Consciousness has stopped introducing the idea and has begun living from it instead. What makes this stage challenging is not complexity, but simplicity. The mind often resists ordinariness, mistaking it for indifference. Yet indifference is not the absence of desire. It is the absence of lack. Fulfillment that feels normal is the precise position where effort dissolves and persistence becomes effortless. It is here that reality begins reorganizing quietly, without announcement or spectacle. And it is also here that the senses tend to protest most strongly, because the outer world rarely changes at the same moment the inner one does. The moment the fulfilled state is assumed as normal, appearances seem to lag behind, creating a subtle tension. The mind notices the contrast and feels the urge to check, to verify, to correct. This is not failure. It is the next threshold. The challenge is no longer how to enter the state, but how to remain there when the senses argue otherwise. The moment a new state begins to feel natural inwardly, the outer world often appears to do the opposite. Circumstances present themselves with renewed clarity, facts seem louder, and conditions feel oddly persistent. This is not coincidence, nor is it punishment. It is the simple mechanics of divided consciousness. When attention wavers between what is assumed and what is perceived, tension arises, not because reality is resisting, but because two positions are being occupied at once. The senses report history, while the assumption announces a conclusion. Until one is given precedence, the experience feels like being stretched between two timelines. A clear analogy reveals this struggle. It is like a tug of war between yesterday and tomorrow, each pulling with equal force. Yesterday is represented by facts, memory, and visible conditions. Tomorrow is represented by assumption, identity, and inner fulfillment. When consciousness stands in the middle, neither side moves. The rope stays taut, effort increases, and exhaustion sets in. But the moment attention releases one side, movement becomes inevitable. Reality does not require force, it requires singular direction. Circumstances always lag behind assumption because they are effects, not causes. They are echoes of previous states, faithfully reflecting what consciousness occupied earlier. To argue with them is to argue with the past. To negotiate with them is to give them authority they do not possess. Facts feel convincing because they are tangible, measurable, and socially reinforced, yet they remain secondary. They have no creative power of their own. Their only function is to display what has already been assumed. This is why refusing to negotiate with appearances is not denial but alignment. It is the recognition that facts are reports, not commands. Consciousness does not need to overpower them or pretend they do not exist. It simply needs to stop consulting them for guidance. The moment attention stops asking circumstances for permission, their influence weakens naturally. They begin to rearrange, not because they were fought, but because their source has shifted. Neville Goddard described this stage as the test of faith, not in the moral sense, but in the positional sense. Faith in his teaching was loyalty to an assumption despite sensory contradiction, not emotional intensity, not blind optimism, but quiet consistency. The outer world may shout, but it cannot outvote the state that consciousness consistently inhabits. Sound carries no authority over position. As this becomes clearer, the struggle with facts begins to dissolve. What once felt like opposition is seen as inertia, a simple delay in momentum. The inner state has already moved. The outer world is still catching up. To remain unmoved during this interval, attention must become more disciplined, not through force, but through rest. Where attention settles determines which side of the rope is released, and it is attention, more than effort or will, that decides whether persistence holds or collapses. What you rest in, you reinforce. As the pull of appearances weakens, a more precise understanding of persistence begins to emerge. Persistence is not sustained effort applied to a thought, but sustained attention resting within a state. Attention is not passive, it is consent. Wherever attention settles, life is quietly instructed to continue in that direction. This is why persistence feels exhausting when attention is scattered and effortless when it is settled. The work was never about holding on tighter, but about resting more consistently. A familiar image makes this clear. Imagine tuning a radio. At first, the signal is filled with static. The instinct may be to keep turning the dial back and forth, searching for clarity. But clarity does not come from constant adjustment. It comes from choosing a station and remaining there long enough for the signal to stabilize. The static fades, not because it was fought, but because attention stopped wandering. Consciousness works the same way. When attention keeps jumping between states, nothing resolves. When it rests, coherence forms. This is why force is such a poor tool for inner change. Force introduces resistance. It implies opposition, effort, and struggle. Gentle redirection, on the other hand, implies certainty. When attention drifts toward doubt or appearances, returning it does not require correction or criticism. It requires recognition. The mind is simply being guided back to where it already decided to live. Persistence is not about preventing distraction forever, but about returning without drama each time attention wanders. Neville Goddard emphasized this distinction with great care. He did not advise battling unwanted thoughts or suppressing sensory input. He advised returning to the feeling, returning to the assumption, returning to the inner position. Resistance gives unwanted states energy. Return withdraws energy without conflict. Over time, what is returned to strengthens and what is ignored dissolves. When attention rests in fulfillment, even briefly but consistently, the state gains density. It begins to feel heavier, more real, more stable. The need to check fades because attention is no longer bored or uncertain. It has something to rest in. This is the moment persistence stops feeling like a task and starts feeling like a preference. Consciousness naturally favors what feels settled over what feels unresolved. As this preference stabilizes, effort diminishes further. The inner state no longer needs constant reinforcement because attention has learned where to sit. The mind becomes quieter, not through discipline but through satisfaction, and it is precisely here in this quieter rhythm that the most effortless form of persistence becomes available. There is a time and place where attention relaxes completely, where the inner state can be entered without resistance or monitoring. That place is not during the strain of the day, but during the soft descent into sleep. Sleep is where persistence becomes automatic. There is a natural point in every day when effort releases itself, when the mind softens and the body no longer demands direction. In this threshold between waking and sleep, attention becomes less argumentative and more receptive. The critical faculties loosen, not because they are forced aside, but because they are no longer needed. This is the state that has always held a quiet, creative authority. When consciousness enters it gently, persistence no longer feels like something that must be maintained. It becomes something that sustains itself. This condition, often referred to as the state akin to sleep, is not powerful because it is dramatic, but because it is unguarded. The mind is no longer scanning for contradiction or proof. It is no longer negotiating with facts. It simply accepts impressions as they arise. In this openness, even a brief implication carries more weight than hours of strained visualization performed in a fully alert state. The value lies not in length, but in permeability. What enters consciousness here does not meet resistance on the way in. A simple analogy captures this perfectly. It is like setting a timer before leaving a room. Once the setting is made, nothing more needs to be done. The process continues on its own, without supervision. In the same way, a short scene or feeling that implies fulfillment, when entered at this edge of sleep, continues to work without further effort. Consciousness does not need to be reminded. It has already accepted the instruction. This is why effortful visualization often disappoints. When the mind is fully awake, it wants to control the image, adjust it, improve it, and monitor its effectiveness. That vigilance prevents impression. In contrast, a brief, simple implication felt at night does not provoke analysis. It slips past the surface mind and settles directly into the deeper layers of identity. The scene does not need to be vivid, it only needs to feel final. Neville Goddard placed great emphasis on how the day is ended, because the final state carried into sleep becomes the starting point for the next cycle of experience. Ending the day fulfilled is not symbolic, it is causal. Consciousness moves forward from where it last rested. When fulfillment is the final position, the next day unfolds from completion rather than from seeking. As this becomes a nightly rhythm, persistence becomes almost invisible. There is no longer a sense of holding on during the day, because the state has already been impressed at the deepest level. Attention no longer needs to police itself constantly. It naturally returns to the assumed position because that position feels familiar and safe. The inner argument quiets, not through suppression but through resolution. When the state is locked in this way, something subtle but important shifts. Action begins to change without instruction. Decisions feel calmer. Movement feels less forced. The need to push dissolves because alignment has already been established. What follows is not effort, but response. And in that response, the mechanics of reality begin to reveal themselves more clearly. Movement follows alignment. Once the inner state has stabilized, a quiet misunderstanding often dissolves on its own. Many expect action to precede alignment, believing that movement is what creates momentum. Yet the order is always the reverse. Action that matters emerges only after alignment has settled. Before that point, movement is often frantic, strategic, or compensatory. After alignment, it becomes natural, almost incidental. It does not feel like effort applied to force a result, but like the next obvious step revealing itself. An analogy illustrates this with simplicity. Doors do not open before you walk toward them. They open as you approach. The act of walking does not cause the door to exist. It merely places you in the position where opening becomes relevant. In the same way, inspired action does not appear in advance as a plan or instruction. It appears in sequence, responding to the inner position already assumed. Consciousness moves first. Circumstances rearrange second. Action follows last, as a byproduct of coherence rather than a tool for creation. This is why calm decisions replace hustle when alignment is real. The nervous urgency to make something happen fades because there is no longer anything to chase. Choices feel quieter, simpler, and strangely unremarkable. You are not trying to arrive somewhere. You are moving from a place that already feels settled. The mind is no longer scanning for the right move because it is no longer afraid of stagnation. Movement arises organically, often without being labeled as manifestation at all. Neville Goddard referred to this sequence as the bridge of incidents, not a single dramatic leap, but a series of ordinary steps that appear inevitable only in hindsight. Each incident feels natural at the moment it occurs, not orchestrated or forced. This is why interference is so disruptive. Attempting to control the bridge is an admission that the destination is still uncertain. Non-interference, by contrast, is a silent acknowledgement that the end has already been secured. When alignment is present, action loses its emotional charge. There is no anxiety about timing, no obsession with efficiency, and no need to justify each move. The body responds to the inner state with appropriate behavior, just as it responds to hunger or rest without intellectual debate. Action becomes a function, not a strategy. And because it is not driven by lack, it does not exhaust. As this becomes clearer, a larger realization begins to surface. Reality is not responding to effort, planning, or intensity. It is responding mechanically to assumption. The sequence is precise and impersonal. State gives rise to movement, and movement gives rise to outcomes. Once this is seen, trust deepens naturally, not as belief, but as understanding. And with that understanding comes a final clarity about the nature of reality itself, a clarity that makes resistance seem almost impossible. The mirror must reflect the face. At this stage, the mechanics of reality reveal themselves with stark clarity. What once appeared personal, unpredictable, or resistant is seen as something far more precise. Reality does not negotiate with consciousness. It does not evaluate worthiness, timing, or effort. It reflects. Once an assumption is occupied steadily enough, the outer world has no creative discretion. It must respond, not because it agrees, but because reflection is its only function. The mirror does not decide what to show. It can only return what stands before it. A simple analogy captures this inevitability. A thermostat does not argue with the temperature in the room. It enforces the setting it has been given. If the environment drifts, the mechanism quietly corrects it until alignment is restored. Consciousness operates in the same way. When a state is persistently occupied, reality adjusts its conditions to match. Delay does not indicate failure, it indicates calibration. The system is not resisting the assumption, it is reorganizing around it. This is why persistence always outlasts delay. Time has no authority over a fixed state. The moment consciousness stops wavering, the outcome becomes inevitable, even if unseen. The outer world may appear unchanged for a while, but that appearance is deceptive. Movement has already begun at levels that are not immediately visible. Circumstances rearrange gradually. Relationships shift subtly. Opportunities reposition themselves quietly. Nothing dramatic announces the change, yet everything is being redirected. Neville Goddard emphasized that reality is obedient, not resistant. What feels like opposition is simply the echo of previous assumptions completing their course. Once that echo fades, only the current state remains to be expressed. Reality does not possess memory of its own. It borrows memory from consciousness. When consciousness changes what it consistently occupies, reality has nothing left to reflect except the new position. This understanding removes the final trace of struggle. There is no longer a sense of persuading the world, convincing circumstances, or overcoming obstacles. The relationship reverses. Reality is no longer the authority issuing verdicts. It is the instrument carrying out instructions. Persistence is no longer an act of hope, but an act of recognition. The end is not something being waited for. It is something already established inwardly, awaiting only its appointed moment of visibility. With this clarity, effort collapses completely. There is nothing left to manage, fix, or force. The instruction becomes almost embarrassingly simple, not because it is easy for the mind, but because it leaves the mind with nothing to manipulate. Consciousness either remains in the assumed state or it does not. And when it does, reality, bound by its own nature, has no choice but to follow. Persist in being, not getting. When everything is stripped back to its essence, one truth remains steady beneath the noise. Creation does not respond to effort aimed at getting, but to consistency rooted in being. The moment consciousness stops chasing outcomes and settles into a state, the entire mechanism of reality realigns. What felt like strain was never caused by desire itself, but by the habit of standing outside fulfillment and waiting for permission from appearances. Being precedes having, and remaining precedes movement. This is the core of Neville's teaching. Persistence is not repetition, patience, or endurance. It is loyalty to an inner position. When attention no longer runs ahead to check results, the mirror is finally allowed to change. Reality does not bend under pressure or intensity, but under stability. Once a state is lived in without surveillance, it begins to express itself outwardly in ways that feel natural rather than forced. Modern language reaches the same conclusion through coherence. Joe Dispenza explains that sustained identity produces inevitable external change. When thoughts, emotions, and self-concept align consistently, the body and environment must reorganize. The delay that so often frustrates people is not resistance, but adjustment. Reality is recalibrating to match what consciousness has decided to live from. This is why fulfillment works best when it is quiet and ordinary. At night, as the mind softens and effort dissolves, the state is entered as though the matter is already resolved. There is no need to revisit it compulsively or look for proof the next day. Proof belongs to effects, not causes. When persistence shifts from getting to being, reality responds automatically. Circumstances rearrange, decisions soften, and movement unfolds without strain. The process does not require belief in possibility, only residence in assumption. Persist in the feeling not as a technique but as a home. From that position, reality has no choice but to follow.